Welcome to Conversations with Kay. I'm Kay Ryder. And every week I talk with Vermonters who are leaders in the fields of government, healthcare, education, the arts, and community life. And welcome to our listeners on 99.3 FM, WBVT FM. Our guest is Diane Snelling, and she is the chair of the Vermont Natural Resources Board. Welcome back, Diane.
Thank you very much, Kay. It's great to be here.
Yep, well, now you know. What is the role of the Vermont Natural Resources Board?
The Natural Resources Board oversees Act 250, which is a series of laws that were enacted by the legislature in the 1970s.
Okay. Now, how long have you been chair of the committee?
I've been chair since March of 2016, so just about 3.5 years now.
Great, great. Now, we hear a lot about Act 250, and why was it started?
It was started because Dean Davis was very interested in the economic development that was going on in southern Vermont at that time. After the interstate was finished, we had a lot more tourists coming, and there was a sudden surge of second homes being built in southern Vermont on steep slopes with thin soils, and there were no controls about septic and things like that, and so he observed septic running downhill.
Great.
And was very distressed by it, and that began the Gibb Commission, which led to Act 250, which was about having regulation that would ensure that there were no adverse impacts from development.
This is Governor Dean Davis, and he was actually ahead of his time, wasn't he?
Yes. Well, I like to think of something I read quite a bit about him in that time frame, and one of the things that he said that I found very interesting being a student of government was that he had something like 300 people reporting to him directly when he first came in as governor. And that was one of the things that led him to create the Agency of Administration, because there was simply no way that you could manage that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Can you imagine?
No.
Oh, dear Lord. Okay, has Act 250 actually been quite successful?
I think you would find different opinions from different people on that, but I think it has been, because I think some of the things we still value about the way Vermont looks were helped along by Act 250, that we want to preserve our traditional settlement patterns of a village interspersed with rural areas and then another village, and trying to keep that as as the way we grow, and that's hard.
Oh, yeah.
So I think it has made a difference in reducing sprawl to some extent, and encouraging people to think about what the impacts of development are.
Why did the Vermont legislature actually decide it was time to overhaul Act 250?
I think there are a variety of reasons. The Act 250 has been adjusted or tweaked or messed with, whatever you want to say, pretty much every legislative session. So there's always something that's being changed. And sometimes they are simply they are a part of an overall process, and so you're not necessarily getting at root causes if you just change a little thing here or there. And sometimes you're creating bigger problems by not seeing the consequences. So I think that was part of the motivation is, well, let's take a good long look. It's 50 years, that's a good amount of time to say
sure is.
It's worked, it hasn't worked, we need to do this, we need to do that. So I think that was the motivation, yeah.
I'm talking with Diane Snelling, and she's the chair of the Vermont Natural Resources Board. We're talking about Act 250 and the update of Act 250, Vermont's environmental law. Diane, the Vermont legislature set up a study commission.
Yes.
And to work on the bill and to, updating it.
Right.
They had hopes to really move it along in some way in the last legislative session, and that didn't happen. Can you explain a bit about why that didn't happen?
Yeah, first of all, they took an enormous amount of testimony. So the bill was structured that they would work on this for over 2 years. And the first year, they took a lot of testimony from state agencies and a variety of lawyers and, a very diverse group of people. And the second summer, they went out and went to 6 different meetings all over the state of Vermont and listened to people and tried to get ideas for what people wanted to change. So they had all this material. They also took in comments via email from hundreds of people. So I think synthesizing it was a little harder than they may have thought it would be. Nevertheless, I think they worked very hard on it, and what they produced is now a committee bill in House Natural Resources. So that's where all of that material is. And last year was kind of a rough start for it for a variety of reasons. You had a new committee with a new chair because the longtime chair, David Dean, had retired. And so I think that all of those things together conspire to slow it down. You need people to understand what things are now in order to understand what they want to change. And so you had to bring everybody up to speed a little bit.
Right, which brings us to the idea that in order to pass a bill through the Vermont legislature, it takes time.
It does take time.
And you have
Takes
testimony.
patience.
A little luck, maybe.
Perseverance, all those things, yes.
Yeah. I mean, people don't realize, healthcare, environment, all these ideas are very, very, very complicated, and you get people coming to testify before the committees and giving their opinion, and it all on pro and con on things.
Sure.
It takes a long time.
It does, and I think when the public recognizes that the legislature is asking for more and more drafting requests, that means that there are more and more pieces of legislation being considered. They have even less time to look at each thing. And I'm sort of hopeful that in the near future they might try to limit that for themselves to say, well, we'll only consider this amount of things so that we have enough time in what's allotted to us.
Now, you were a state senator, Diane.
Yes.
Our people in Vermont government have no staff.
Well, that's true. Yes, that's
and that
true.
makes it even harder.
Well, it makes it different in Vermont because you achieve things differently. You have certainly the assistance of legislative counsel, which is essential in terms of the law and how the law works and how something you might propose could work or not work. And certainly the money committees have additional assistance from joint fiscal. But you don't have anybody who's working for you.
Right.
There are a lot of interns now that help people with constituent work because since the advent of email, you can get hundreds of emails, especially if an advocacy group is asking people to contact their legislators.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Oh, yeah. Now, part of the problem, as I understood it, was it's complex. But also 2 big issues came up. One was climate change and how that's going to affect environmental issues in Vermont. And the other was wildlife habitat. Big pieces of land left for the bear, the moose, or whoever, right?
Right. So I think climate change is definitely a big subject everywhere. I mean, it kind of impacts all aspects of life. I don't know that it was a particular problem in the discussion about Act 250 because a lot of people had different views that it should be incorporated into the 10 criteria in some way, or potentially there would be a new criteria that would refer to it. And the issue is kind of what is it that you could review that would contribute to climate change or help mitigate impacts of climate change. And so I think that's where it sort of is resting at the moment and ready to go forward is, could we look specifically at how close things are to rivers and floodplains and try even harder to encourage towns and villages to move growth away from the rivers? I mean, that's one thing in terms of prevention.
Yeah, and this stops supposedly some of the pollution in Lake Champlain too.
Yes. I think what you want to do is you want to have clean streams and rivers if you're going to have a clean lake.
Right.
And that's true all over Vermont. It isn't just Lake Champlain.
Yep. So now Act 250 has been controversial. At least we've heard a lot about the controversy. Some have said that it stymied business growth and long, slow process. Do you think you can end up with an Act 250 which will please both businesses and environmentalists? Are they that far apart in many ways?
Yeah, I'm working very hard for that goal, Kay.
Yeah.
And I think some of it is clarity. It's like if you know what you have to provide and why you have to provide it in terms of your application, I think it's less. It seems less of a task than it might if you just thought it was a ridiculous thing to be asked for. Certainly it's controversial. A lot of developers would prefer no regulation.
Of course.
Why not,
Sure,
right?
sure. Yeah.
On the other hand, I think there are a lot of very responsible developers who are pleased that they can show that they care by paying attention to the requirements. And so I think ultimately what it comes down to is having a system that's easy to apply. You know what's necessary for your application, and it's completely transparent how that process works and when you get your permit. And I just wanted to add, we've done a lot of analysis based on the perspective that people have that it takes a long time, and discovered that a very high percentage of our permits are issued in less than 60 days. So that doesn't mean all, but it's a very high percentage, and I would say almost all permits are issued in 90 days or less, and so except for very large projects, and some of that time is consumed by getting other permits.
Local permits.
Well, local permits, but also from the Agency of Natural Resources, especially if you have a wetland that needs to be delineated. That can really only be done when you can dig in the dirt, so you can't get it done in the wintertime. So there are natural things that can extend a project.
I'm talking with Diane Snelling, and Diane is the chair of the Vermont Natural Resources Board, and we're talking about update for Act 250, Vermont's environmental law. What percentage, do you have any idea, what percentage of the total of, things that have come before Act 250 to be voted on, what percentage went through? What are we looking at here?
A very small percentage is denied. So
Very
I think a
small
very high
denied.
percentage is approved. Okay,
Right.
Practically all projects are approved. What you need to remember is it's not that they are approved exactly as they were proposed.
Right.
There are frequently changes requested, and there are pretty much always conditions that are written into a permit that ensure that if there are possible impacts, that they're mitigated.
Well, that's interesting. I think a lot of people don't realize how many. Most have been approved.
Right.
Right. Okay. Should there be a different way to approach growth in an urban area like Burlington versus a very rural area like Grand Isle?
Well, Burlington has a lot of laws and zoning and lots of its own perspective on development. So, it has a very thorough development process. And I think it probably has one of the more sophisticated approaches, as do several other large cities in Vermont. But rural communities, don't even necessarily have a full-time zoning administrator, so they need a little bit more support in responding.
Now, we have a big hole in the middle of Burlington.
Yes.
Did that go through Act 250?
Only to determine whether the project was going to be a priority housing project, which requires certain percentages to be affordable, and it's a percentage of the overall square footage, et cetera. So there was a lot of calculation that went on. But in the end, it did qualify, and that meant it didn't have to go through Act 250.
Okay, so that was the city of Burlington's regs, if you will.
Yeah.
Yep. Interesting. Of all the developments, that are approved by Act 250. Now, if something is denied, why is it often denied?
Because it may be on a piece of property where you can't mitigate what the impacts would be to the environment. In other words, usually it's because the project will result in pretty serious damage. It's not because people don't like it. You know, there's facts that support that this would not be a good project because.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so rare.
Wetlands, things like that?
A whole variety of things, yeah.
Okay, let's name some of them.
Oh, well, I mean, I don't have them off the top of my head of what specific projects have been denied for which reasons, but, you know, the issue is that it's conceived it's too large a building for the lot. You know, it doesn't have access to public drinking water and, you know, I mean, things like that where you kind of have these obstacles, which is not to say they can't be overcome. But if the applicant doesn't want to change the project, then they might just withdraw it also.
Come back again?
Perhaps, yeah, with a different project.
Right, right. But if you aren't approved, is there an appeals process?
Absolutely. You know, you can appeal a jurisdictional opinion which says whether a project should be under Act 250 jurisdiction, and you can certainly appeal a decision of the commission. They issue the permits, the district commission.
Now, who hears these appeals again now?
The Superior Court Environmental Division.
Okay.
Around 2004, there was permit reform that concluded in, instead of appeals being heard by what was at that time the Environmental Board, that they would go to the Environmental Division of Superior Court. And a lot of people believe that has contributed to predictability and consistency, because the court is kind of reputable. And
yeah, now if you have a citizens group dealing with this, the appeal, are you allowed to get into the question of Republicans and Democrats?
I'm not sure I understand.
Well, you know, political influences, political opinions.
In front of the court?
No. If you go from the court, if you go from the court to a citizens appeal group, would you get into problems of you know, how people feel in their various political parties?
It's usually not at all partisan. It's much more tends to be much more, you know, residents near the project.
Okay. All right.
Not politics.
Okay.
Although there's politics and everything, but.
That's so true. There's politics and everything, Diane. We won't go into that. No. We don't have time for all that. Representative Amy Sheldon of Middlebury has a very busy schedule. She chairs this study commission on Act 250, and she's also the chair of the House Committee on Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife. I mean, she has a huge job. She hopes to come to the legislature this coming session, I believe, and try to get this updated bill through the legislative session in 2020. Do you think that will happen or not?
I hope it will. I hope that in conversation, discussion, et cetera, it could be narrowed a little bit, because it's very broad in its ambitions at this point. And sometimes I've experienced in the legislature that you need to have pieces that people can see around and understand. And then if it gets too big, they get very concerned about something they might not know, which is understandable. So I think one of the things that will be helpful is if we can start to find places where there is agreement and work on those.
Do we ever have instances in Vermont where something is started and it has to stop for archaeological reasons or anything like that?
Well, the Division of Historic Preservation gets involved in quite a few projects because they have mapped out areas that are sensitive to archaeological time in terms of artifacts that might be found, and also just historic properties. So they are able to come into the Act 250 process and comment on things, and through those comments have an impact on preserving historic properties and artifacts.
Right. Now, do you think it's important for the public to understand as much as possible about Act 250 and its update, and why it has taken so much time to update it.
I think it was imagined as a long-term project, so it wouldn't get a quick once-over. And sometimes imagining, sort of putting things in a context of a longer time frame actually makes them more complicated because you have that time to think it through. But I think it's a big subject.
Oh.
I really do. And I think for a lot of people, the more they learn about it, the more questions they have. And so I think that's part of it. I also feel that people don't want to make it worse. So there's a little bit of reluctance, you know, as I was saying before, you have to know what you're trying to change.
Right.
And so everybody, trying to get everybody, you know, very familiar with the ins and outs of particular parts of Act 250 it takes time. So, and I hope it also means that people are being careful. Legislators are being careful.
Right.
About,
yeah, and there's a lot of thought now about climate
Right.
change and how
Right.
it's affecting everything.
Right.
So I think people are looking at the update of 250,
Yep.
Act 250 a little closer now.
Yes, and I think there will be something in there
I think
about
that's-
climate change. Yeah.
I think that's good.
Yeah.
You can't ignore it.
Absolutely not.
I mean, you just
It is
cannot.
happening, and it's already affecting us, and it's affecting forests in terms of which species are growing and which species will replace when we've cut down trees, which kind will come back, and it's also changing different wildlife habitat based on the types of things that are growing in certain areas. I mean, it's really pretty universal change.
Yeah, the average temperature in the fall now in Vermont has gone up.
Yeah.
The average summer temperature has gone up, and that affects what will grow there.
Yes, it does.
And what
yeah.
grows there affects what lives there.
Right.
And it's a big, big issue, and we can't ignore it at all. We ignore it at our peril.
Yes, and I'm sorry to say, I think to some extent we're into the peril part.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question about it. I think my generation and a little bit of yours ignored this a little bit too long.
I think in the beginning it must have seemed hard to understand. I don't recall feeling that way. Like it made sense to me.
Yep.
But I just think it was hard to take in for people.
Yeah. You know, I remember some of the first things I remember are huge hurricanes suddenly.
Yeah.
Devastating.
Well, also a lot of conversation about how rapidly the shorelines will rise, and obviously we're already seeing that as well, and we're seeing rapid melting of the glaciers, which is contributing again to rising oceans.
Yeah. I don't see how anybody can ignore it. But again, I'm not a national leader, so you know, there you go. I don't know. Anyway, how did you decide that you wanted to go into the environmental world rather than be a senator?
Well, I had been a senator for 15 years, which is a good long time. And I had spent a lot of my years in the Senate on the Natural Resources Committee and very engaged in water quality issues and groundwater protection and a whole variety of things that were very connected to Act 250. And so I knew that I had always appreciated that type of work and knew a lot of policy over many years about issues that were part of Act 250. So that was part of it, yeah.
You know, I won't ask you if you found your job challenging.
It is challenging, yes. But it's also fun. I mean, I like trying to solve the customer service issue, which is, it's deep because it goes back and people have stories from the past that they come back to and, really rely on in many ways, even if things have changed. And so to me, it's a challenge to say, well, how easy was it to get this application done? That's what I want people to think of as it was convenient. It's not that it was not demanding, but I understood what the materials, why you needed these materials.
Right.
And, so that it's like the rest of business.
Right. Very important to look at both sides.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you
absolutely.
can.
I think that's why Act 250 is kind of unique, is it doesn't say just protect the environment. It says protect the environment and encourage development. So it really is meant to be that balance.
Yeah. Now, what about the future, Diane? It took us roughly 50 years to say we have a big overview on this thing and
Right.
look at the big issues. Should we go back again in 10 years, 25 years to update it? What do you think?
I don't think it's a particular period of time. I do think we should go back and look at it. I mean, I hope that whatever version it ends up in will last for a while.
Yeah.
But I also think we should be willing to go change any law. When we find a problem with it.
People don't like change, but you have to do it.
But sometimes they don't want things to stay the same either.
Oh,
so.
absolutely. Well, that's good, isn't it? That's
I
good.
think that it's part of the ongoing discussion that engages folks in the world around them.
Right. And you on Act 250, updating it, you have had a lot of impact. Now, a lot of input from just what I would call citizens.
Yes, very broad input, yes.
And
I think that's excellent, and I certainly hope more people will, find out what the committee schedule is and listen to the testimony or send testimony in to be part of this conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, where would someone call if they wanted to have some information or give some input?
Well, the easiest thing is most of the information is on the House Committee on Natural Resources website. So you can read the bill there, and you can see a lot of the material that was submitted during the Commission's research. And that basically you go to Legislature Vermont, and it'll come up for you.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Okay, now Vermont needs jobs.
Yes, it does.
And our younger people particularly. People are leaving the state, as I understand it. Can we have growth, jobs, and still keep our beautiful state? Can this really happen, Diane? Is that what you're working for?
I believe it can, Kay, and I believe it should. I think for Vermont, it's very important. What we have most to offer to the rest of the world is the way we look and what our environment is and the beautiful landscape that we live in. But I think we need to adapt our economic strategies to the kind of businesses that we want in our environment. So we're not going to be inviting big, belching smoke factories. Obviously, we're going to try to do, as the governor has, encourage people who are working from home via telecommuting on the internet and things like that. Light, very inventive, entrepreneurial type businesses, as well as just solid, good jobs.
Yep. Right. Well, I wish you success.
Thank you.
Because if you have success and the commission has success, then Vermont will be even a more beautiful and better place to be. Thank you for coming, Diane.
Thank you, Kay.
And thank you for joining us on Conversations with Kay.